This is the multi-voice text-to-speech podfic reading of Everything But the Kitchen Sink by R33sesPieces. It happened every time one of them bought clothes. Sirius came home with a brand spanking new prescription for eyeglasses and some tortoiseshell frames, and Remus needed them to be the sexy librarian who could only keep a particularly noisy patron quiet by putting a cock down his throat. Remus got a dark sapphire suit for a colleague's wedding, and Sirius had to pull him into a stall in the men's room before they even left the church. And God help anyone who was on the beach that day. Remus learned Sirius had bought the bathing trunks Daniel Craig wore in Casino Royale. It was only through very strategic sun-shade placement and a constant mantra of "spit is not lube" that they managed to avoid arrest. So Remus really shouldn't have been surprised when he came downstairs after ripping off a set of tags and Sirius's jaw was hanging open.
"What are those?"
Sirius asked, their voice already sandpaper rough. Remus glanced down in confusion and tugged at the gray fabric clinging to his hips.
"They're joggers."
Sirius cleared his throat and kept their face in a carefully neutral expression.
"And you're going jogging in them?"
"Thought I might, yeah. David Bowie needs more exercise, and so do I, at that. He and I both could stand to improve our stamina."
Remus bent at the waist to scratch beneath their 3-year-old beagle's chin, and Sirius made a strangled noise behind him.
"Do you?"
Sirius coughed.
"Do you want me to come with? Might be a nice thing to do together."
Remus folded himself neatly in half to stretch his hamstrings and looked between his knees at Sirius sitting behind him.
"Do you want to? Last time you went for a run, you accidentally wound up joining a half marathon."
Sirius hummed in thought, concentrating much more intensely than the question warranted, as they watched his boyfriend touch his toes.
"I'd like to come. I think I took 5th in that half, didn't I?"
"I'm not sure it counts if you joined in the 14th kilometer, love."
Remus took a wide stance and pressed the ball of one foot into the baseboard, arching his back and putting his hands on the wall to get a good stretch in his calf.
"The bloke who gave me the medal seemed to think it was fine."
Sirius's voice sounded strained, and Remus glanced over to see their hand had migrated to their crotch. Remus turned to face them as he caught his foot in his hand, the quad stretch pulling his joggers taut across his hips.
"I'm pretty sure he etched your medal with Sirius stacked, and then offered to blow you in the loo."
"Humph."
Sirius barely bothered to acknowledge Remus's point, too busy cupping themselves through their obviously tented trousers to argue for his victory. That sight never failed to do things to Remus, and he felt himself starting to fill in his own briefs.
"What is it with you and these joggers? They're really nothing special."
Remus spread his legs to a very wide V and moved his hips side to side, trying to stretch out his inner thighs, and also maybe show Sirius his semi.
"Nothing special?"
Sirius squawked, offended.
"Mooney, I can see your entire dick. God, if you actually go running in those."
They trailed off, tongue making a smacking sound against the roof of their mouth as they imagined it. Remus smirked, giving a little extra wiggle as he turned toward the kitchen to grab something to drink. Sirius trailed behind him like a new puppy, practically underfoot and running their fingers along the waistband while Remus got a glass of water from the tap. Sirius plastered himself to Remus's back, dipping their fingers beneath the elastic and brushing them lightly against the flat expanse of skin they found. Remus drank it down and refilled it, turning his head and catching Sirius's lips in a sloppy kiss. Remus ran his tongue along the seam of their lips, and they opened to let him slip his tongue inside. Sirius caught his lower lip between their teeth and nibbled, then started kissing across his jaw and down the side of his neck. Soft lips suddenly turned into the harsh scrape of teeth at the curve where neck met shoulder, sending a jolt of pleasure and pain straight to his semi-hard dick. Remus shuddered bodily and arched into the touch, spilling his glass all over himself. Remus squeaked as cold water poured all down his front, sticking his t-shirt to his stomach and the stretchy material of his joggers hugged everything.
"Oh no."
Sirius moaned dramatically, reaching for the dish towel hanging near the drying rack.
"I'm so sorry, Moons. What a clumsy, graceless brute I am."
His eyes glinted and they grinned mischievously as they started pawing at Remus's lower body, using far more squeezing and rubbing than was strictly necessary.
Dave and I are never going to go for a walk at this rate.
Remus whined breathlessly, cock fully hard and hips canting into the hand Sirius was still pressing to the outside of his sopping joggers.
A real shame, that. I was fully planning to have a nice wank to the thought of your perfect dick flopping about all over the place while you jogged through the park.
Sirius hummed happily. Remus snorted at his ridiculousness, and Sirius huffed.
Putting on a nice show for all those people, knowing they can't have you because you're mine. Fuck, baby, it was going to be so hot.
Remus shivered at the thought of Sirius's hand on their dick and the way Sirius was still cupping him. He tilted his head to bare his goose-pimpled skin for their lips. Sirius brushed their nose against the curve of his neck and pulled an earlobe between their teeth.
Poor thing, you're freezing.
They tutted, sliding their hands beneath Remus's shirt and peeling the sodden cloth over his head. Sirius's shirt followed immediately after, then, they wrapped their arms back around him and pulled Remus's bare back into their warmth.
That's not all that's cold.
Remus pouted. Sirius ran their hands up and down his sides, deliberately misunderstanding his complaint, and eventually settled their thumbs in to rub circles on his hips. They sucked a series of bruises into his neck and shoulders while their palms wandered up his chest and across his stomach, following the thin trail of hair beneath his belly button into his briefs. The warmth of their hands against his hard dick after the cold water made his breath catch. He felt Sirius smile against his neck.
Let's get you out of these, yeah?
They nipped his neck gently and pulled his joggers and briefs to his ankles in one swift motion, then hit their knees right after. Sirius turned him to rub their nose against his base, his flushed cock rubbing against their cheek, and ran the tip of his tongue along the vein all the way to his slit. Remus keened, his desire tumbling out of him in sounds he couldn't control, and they looked up at him with wicked silver eyes. They caught his cock in their mouth and let it rest heavily on their tongue, staring up at him, daring him to take what they knew he wanted. Remus bit his lip and whimpered, but he waited them out. He knew patience was always rewarded with Sirius, who had so very little patience of their own. The pair stared at each other for a few moments, locked in a battle of wills, broken only when Remus moved to cup their jaw with firm fingers. Sirius's eyes softened and fluttered closed at his touch, and finally he sealed their lips around Remus. They held his hips firmly to the cabinets behind him and immediately set a punishing pace, taking him to the back of their throat and hollowing their cheeks within a couple strokes. The suddenness of it all had Remus arching and crying out, gripping the countertop behind him with one hand while the other twined itself in Sirius's dark hair. Sirius swallowed him all the way down, the wet heat of their mouths surrounding him, their throat flexing rhythmically and bringing Remus closer to his edge faster than he cared to admit. He tugged on Sirius's curls and their eyes rolled back with pleasure, a groan escaping their throat and vibrating through Remus's cock.
Siri, baby, please, please, I'm gonna.
He babbled frantically, finally pulling Sirius's head back far enough that they came off with an obscene pop, a long string of saliva still connecting their mouth to his head. They looked absolutely debauched, lips swollen and red, a high pink flush along their cheekbones, curly hair mussed from Remus's rough treatment, eyes glassy with tears from taking him so deeply. God, Remus loved them.
Fuck, baby, you taste so good.
Sirius praised, voice rough and fucked out, the sound alone enough to make Remus whimper.
Need more. Need to taste all of you.
They rasped and pushed his hips to face the cabinets. They squeezed his arse cheeks firmly, kneading the muscle as they spread him apart, swiped their tongue in a broad stripe along his crease, then sank their teeth into the meat of his arse hard enough Remus was surprised he didn't draw blood. He whined and instinctively jerked his hips forward so his overheated dick, still tacky from Sirius's saliva, was rubbing against the hard wood of the cabinets. Sirius raised their hand and spanked him, the slap echoing through the kitchen.
Hold still.
Sirius growled, and Remus immediately froze.
Good boy.
They purred, placing a light peck right over the dental record Sirius left on his arse. Then they spread his cheeks wide and licked and sucked around his hole until his knees were trembling beneath him and he was smearing pre-cum all over their cupboards. Sirius alternated running the flat of their tongue over his entrance and lightly tracing his rim with the tip, making him giggle and writhe. After what felt like hours of teasing, Sirius breached him with their tongue, and Remus allowed himself to collapse forward onto the cold quartz countertop. Sirius groaned with pleasure at the change in position and took another nip of the round flesh of his arse. Remus's eyelids fluttered shut. Fuck, they felt so good inside him. Sirius opened him up as wide as they could using only his mouth, then slipped one, and very quickly two, fingers inside his stretched out hole. Remus felt a moan reverberate through his body and glanced back to see Sirius had pulled his own fleece pajama bottoms down in front, exposing their own flushed cock and balls. They were thrusting into their clenched fist and swiping their thumb over their head on every stroke, their eyes rolling back in their head in ecstasy clear on what he could see of their face. Remus was pretty sure he could come just watching them. Then they crooked their fingers inside him, and the edges of his vision went white. He felt his breath punching out in short bursts and his whole body felt like it was on fire as he rode Sirius's face and fingers.
Oh fuck, oh god, please, Padfootar. Please, fuck, oh my god, right there, fuck, please.
Remus mumbled a constant string of begging and nonsense, and he felt the warm breath of Sirius's laugh on his sensitive skin. He clenched around them at the sensation, and they hummed in delight.
Think you can come just from this? Could you do that for me, baby?
They asked, and Remus whimpered a yes as he nodded into his cool stone pillow, now slippery with his sweat.
Good, good. Come for me, love, just on my fingers. You look so good, baby. I love to watch you fall apart for me.
They crooked their fingers again, pressing firmly into his prostate with a constant pressure, and Remus felt himself near the edge of the cliff. He panted into his arms, high-pitched keen spilling from his lips with every breath as he rode Sirius's hand, until they sank their teeth into his unmarked arsecheek. The bite shoved him over the edge and his orgasm ripped through him, his body shuddering as he cried out Sirius's name and painted their espresso cabinets with thick stripes of white.
So good for me.
Sirius breathed as they kissed their way up Remus's back.
You look so good when you come for me. I love you so much.
They wrapped their arms around Remus's torso and pressed a firm kiss to his head. He whimpered at his emptiness and twitched his hips against the hard line of Sirius's cock sliding between his cheeks. Sirius chuckled and nuzzled at Remus's ear.
So eager, aren't you, love? Can't wait for me to fill you up.
Please.
Remus groaned. Sirius rutted against him, and Remus's breath hitched when Sirius's head caught on his rim. They wrenched the nearest drawer open and fumbled within, tossing aside pens and batteries and a menu for the Thai place down the road before they found the small bottle of lube. Sirius slicked their cock, kicked his feet wider apart, lined themselves up, and slid inside him in one long, smooth motion that sent sparks up Remus's spine. He let out a wanton moan and tipped his head back on their shoulder, while Sirius spread one hand wide over his stomach and the other under his arm and up to wrap around his throat. Sirius pressed him tightly to their chest as he started to move their hips in slow circles, a relentless pressure on Remus's prostate that was just this side of too much, so close to his last orgasm, making him fully hard again in moments. Sirius started rocking their pelvis faster but kept himself buried deep inside Remus. The short, deep thrusts punched the breath out his lungs in sharp, whining pants and made his dripping cock bounce almost painfully with each stroke. He wrapped one hand around the back of Sirius's head and buried his fingers in their crown, and he gripped their hip with the other, urging them harder, faster, deeper. Remus loved being able to feel them everywhere, pressed together from head to toe, around him, inside him, their hair and breath and sweat mingling as they became one. Sirius finally took him in hand and coordinated their strokes, and Remus turned himself over to them completely. He let himself be overwhelmed in the sensation of being with Sirius, being cared for by Sirius, being the object of Sirius's affection and desire. He didn't even hear his own whines until sharp teeth on his shoulder made him cry out and tug on their hair.
Baby.
He gasped, hips rocking between their hand and their cock as he chased pleasure from one to the other. They let out a guttural moan and gripped him tighter, grinding into his prostate again while they panted into his neck and slowed. Sirius pulled out, turned him around, and lifted him off his feet. Remus wrapped his legs around their waist and lined them up so they could push inside, both of them relishing the smooth glide as Sirius slid home again. Sirius gripped his arse firmly and slid a tender hand along his spine while he nuzzled just below his jaw. They tried to pull his lips close for a kiss, but Remus wrinkled his nose and turned his head. Sirius huffed a soft laugh into his neck.
Bloody hypocrite, you.
They bit at his pulse point and chuckled fondly.
Love it when I make a meal of your ass, but won't kiss me after.
Gross.
Remus pouted, wondering if the rimming was worth it if it meant he couldn't kiss Sirius now. His cock twitched and a drop of precum spilled out of his slit at the memory. Okay, so it was definitely a fair trade-off. Sirius barked a laugh at the glazed-over look on his face. They canted their hips once, making Remus yelp in surprise, and sucked a bruise into his neck.
See? Like I said. Bloody hypocrite.
Remus started bouncing himself minutely in Sirius's arms, desperate for their cock to resume its steady drag inside him and get some friction on his own aching dick. They grunted with the effort of holding him up and took 3 cautious steps until Remus was pressed against the side of the refrigerator. He hissed as his back hit the cold metal, and Sirius pinned him into it with their hips.
You okay, baby?
They asked, and Remus nodded frantically, already starting to rock himself up and down Sirius's hard length. Sirius leaned forward so the weight of their hips was supporting Remus and started to roll them smoothly, a slide and drag across his prostate that had him clenching around them in seconds. He wrapped his arms around them and met them thrust for thrust, mouthing blindly at their neck and jaw and digging his nails into their shoulder blades. Sirius slid a hand up the wall so their chests were pressed together and Remus's cock was trapped between them, spreading precum across both of their stomachs. Sirius picked up the pace, snapping his hips hard enough to rock the fridge Remus was pressed against, and Remus could feel his second orgasm rapidly building. Sirius's fingers were gripping him so tight he knew there would be bruises on his thighs. The grunts and gasps they were letting out right next to his ear were driving him mad. The warmth of their breath on his neck contrasting with the cold against his back made all of his skin tingle, and he needed to kiss them. Needed to taste them. Needed their mouth on his. Remus pulled himself closer and captured Sirius's lips in a searing kiss, their tongues sliding together and Sirius groaning into his mouth. When Remus caught their lower lip between his teeth, Sirius's thrust started to stutter as they neared his climax, and the divine friction on his cock sent Remus spiraling with them. Sirius came with a shout, a litany of praise intermingled with Remus's name dripping from their tongue, and the euphoria of knowing he was the one who could make Sirius fall apart like that, reduced them to a mumbling puddle of goo and teeth on collarbones, sent him over the edge. He clenched around their still hard dick and coated both of their chests, gasping Sirius's name and collapsing forward to bury his face in their neck. Sirius lowered them gently to the ground and they lay together as their breathing evened and their heartbeats slowed. The pair kissed languidly, with Sirius softly stroking Remus's back and Remus's fingers carting through Sirius's curls, until Sirius flopped their head to the side.
We should keep that.
They nodded toward the cum-splattered cupboard door.
I think it's a really nice contrast in colors. A good conversation piece. What do you think?
Remus made a face.
I think we're going to have to wash every dish in that cabinet.
I think our guests should consider it an honor to swallow moonages. I know I do.
Remus snorted.
I don't know how you manage to constantly toe the line between romantic and absolutely obscene.
He leaned down and pecked Sirius quickly on the lips.
I also think your semen is top-notch, love.
They held each other for a few moments more before Remus got himself up with a wince. Fucking against the wall and a cuddle on the floor was just not as sustainable in their 30s as it was at 19. He grabbed a clean flannel and ran it under warm water, then cleaned both of them up and helped Sirius to their feet. He gathered his still wet clothes from where they'd been tossed and started toward the bathroom.
Come on, baby, shower time, and you're going to have to brush your teeth before I kiss you again.
Sirius tilted their head at him curiously as they watched him gather his exercise gear.
You were never going to take Dave for a jog, were you?
Remus winked at them over his shoulder and smirked.
Baby, you and I both know the only way to get me to run is to chase me.
Sirius wrapped Remus in an embrace from behind that made him squeak and struggle to get away.
You are a bloody menace.
They growled in his ear before licking a broad stripe across the side of his face.
And I fucking love you.
Finite. Thanks for listening to this text-to-speech podfic composed by Burning Aurora.